what I want to do is ask everyone to introduce themselves. I'll start. My name is Claude Marks. I'm the co-director of the Freedom Archives, which is now in Berkeley. Check us out online, freedomarchives.org. It's easy to do. And you can learn a lot about me or the work that we do, more importantly. So I won't say more. I just met Garrett for the first time, maybe within the last half hour. But I will admit that I'm old friends with Sharon and Russell. So I'm going to make a real strong attempt to treat everyone equally. But actually, I'm hoping to get to know Garrett. And that's more the point. So maybe starting with you, Garrett. That's why we're here?
That's what he said.
Okay. That works for me. We've been joking around, so maybe that's a good atmosphere for this conversation, which is actually heavy, right? We're talking about books that are about and by political prisoners. And the U.S. officially doesn't have any of those. And rather than argue about it, we're going to really try to sink our teeth into the issue. And let's do a quick introduction, and then I'll pick it up. You want to start? Garrett, you want to go? Russell? All right.
I'm Russell Shoatz III, son of now ancestor Russell Maroon Shoatz. He was a political prisoner, a Panther, a BLA member. And I'm out of Philadelphia, but now full-time in Vermont, and here with my sister.
I'm Sharon Shoatz. I'm the daughter of Russell Maroon Shoatz. I'm a retired New York City educator, advocate for the freedom of political prisoners and prisoners of war, and a member of the Panther Cubs.
My name is Garrett. It's a tremendous honor to be up here with you all. I'm an organizer, writer, and author of this political biography of Martin Sostre. I'm based out of Portland, Oregon, where I'm starting a radical mobile library, and I'm also a co-founder of the Abolitionist Collective Study and Struggle, which is predominantly based in Mississippi, but supports radical study groups in prisons.
So this question of political prisoners, what do we think about that as a, as a brief way to get us rolling? Because both Martin Sostre and, of course, Maroon Shoatz identified themselves in those terms. Maybe we can ground the conversation in a very brief, not a definition, but maybe a comment about what that really means to us.
You want to go first? Are we going to go this way? Okay, all right, I'll go first on that. Yeah, I mean, you want to?
Okay, I'll break the. So yeah, there's this incredible documentary film from 1974 called Frame Up, The Imprisonment of Martin Sostre, and in it, Martin talks about the concept of a political prisoner and how he differentiates it from a politicized prisoner. So maybe I'll start there just as a way to get into it, because Martin was, interestingly, sort of both of these things in his life. So he did a 6 to 12 year sentence, of which he served the full 12 years, in part because he became very politicized, joined the Nation of Islam during that first 12-year sentence. And then he came home to Buffalo in 1964, or made a home there, started 3 revolutionary bookstores and was framed in the uprising in 1967, therefore sort of becoming a political prisoner. He was one of the only sort of recognized political prisoners during that 9 years by Amnesty International. And one of the things that I sort of struggled with throughout the book was the utility of these distinctions of politicized versus political prisoner, how we, in our movements, choose our support, of people inside broadly, how we understand all prisoners as, imprisoned under a political system of white supremacy and genocide by the settler colonial state of the United States. But I think briefly I'll just say what was really helpful for me in trying to work through that was realizing that during that first sentence when Martin was up for parole and got denied 3 years because of the organizing he was doing inside, that even though I was kind of seeing this as he was a politicized prisoner and then a political prisoner during the second term, that he really became a political prisoner even while inside, that the state uses parole and other forms of post-conviction relief on the back end to keep people inside once they become a political threat. So I just think these terms are really helpful for us as descriptors of thinking about the way that the state represses and the forms of repression that it takes, but maybe less so as creating a sort of hierarchy of who we support and who we don't. So yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, just on political prisoners in general, I agree with what both of you have put out. There was a point in time where people like my father and some other political prisoners made sure that they, and it wasn't because of an ego thing or something that they wanted to do. It was a push at some point that political prisoners actually be separated from, and not separated, but defined in a different way than just prisoners in general, and that there is a connection to the state and political issues when you're incarcerated, even if you didn't take actions against the state. And a Cub raised that at some point, Fred Hampton Jr. with Prisoners of Consciousness, and that raised a political conversation at some point with people chiming in saying, yes, there is actually a difference. And yes, people are political prisoners just because of the state, but it's a difference in a prisoner of conscience and a prisoner who actually took action against the state.
I would just concur. I think at some point early on, there were a lot of distinctions on the term political prisoner, prisoner of war, or a prisoner that became politicized while they were incarcerated. And at some point, I think, and I'm not sure because I can't speak for everyone, but from my father's perspective, he also had some incarnations, but he was also always considered a political prisoner because of his actions that he took against the state. And a prisoner of war, exactly. So, yeah.
So without going deeper into that rabbit hole of definitions, just a quick comment and then I want to circle back. So the process of organizing inside and being politicized is very complex, but it expresses itself in a lot of ways. In 2013, for example, in California, behind organized demands by people who originally were imprisoned for non-political reasons, 30,000 prisoners in the state of California took action by starting to refuse food because of a number of political issues that they were in struggle with the California Department of Corrections. So to get to that place was really an indication of the potential of organizing and building consciousness and politics among prisoners that otherwise weren't starting off in that place. And the fear of the state of that process taking hold and developing is real, which is why people end up in controlling prisons, in isolation, why they're, disincentivized from being political people in those cells. And so that's just an overview. On the other hand, there's people who do ridiculous amounts of time because of that. An example in California is Rochelle McGee, who did 67 years in prison and became politicized and became a prison lawyer and became a fighter. And of course was targeted and had 9 weeks in the streets before dying. And the only reason they released him is that he was at the end of his life as an act of kindness, if you can say that. But I want to circle back, having kind of established sort of a threshold for trying to contextualize these people. Garrett, one of my questions to you about Martin Sostre is, how did he see himself, not just as a political person, but in relationship to being Black, Muslim, and Puerto Rican?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Claude. So Martin was, someone who didn't leave a whole lot about his early life, didn't talk about it a lot, was not interviewed, unfortunately, substantially. So, a lot of what I was researching for this book was sort of the context in which he grew up, which was, Great Depression era Harlem. And it was that sort of context of Black radicalism, of all of these different spaces of communism, Black nationalism that politicized him. But one of the people who really changed the course of his life was he was in jail at the Tombs and met a Puerto Rican nationalist named Julio Pinto Gandia, who had been the head of the Puerto Rican party briefly and was a lawyer. And that had a tremendous impact on Martin's life. And he continued to see himself as a part of Black freedom struggles, and then see the struggle for Puerto Rican independence as completely intertwined with that. And we were talking earlier, Martin's understanding of armed struggle as fundamental to any revolutionary struggle, I think, was very much tied up in his understanding of Puerto Rico as a colonial subject to the United States, and something that I would love to talk about, with Maroon too.
So Maroon, of course, also was committed to militant struggle, which is how we ended up inside. Maybe you could briefly touch on that, but also to reflect on how he identified as a prisoner, as a political prisoner, as a prisoner of war. What did that mean?
I think he identified, as a prisoner of war, and people knew about his voracious study kind of, routines, and so he had, for lack of better terms, found the most, in his mind, revolutionary people historically, culturally, and through his escapes, he got the moniker Maroon. He was coming back and somebody was like, they were chasing me like a maroon. He's like, what's that? And so he started studying that, and that also was a trigger and a kind of kickoff for him into a heightened level for him of the struggle, and their commitment became kind of his commitment. Like, I want to be committed like that. I want to have that never say die attitude and just keep going until I'm free or whatever. That was, I think, a core. I'm not sure. Am I answering the question?
Yeah, I would just add that he, was committed to freedom. I mean, he was never committed to being a subject of the state, so to speak, even though he was incarcerated for most of my adult life, so, but I think his political aspirations, his ideologies, they all changed over time, but it really was I think the injustice that he saw out on the street as a child growing up, and also encountering that as an adult, that, and then it talks about the Malcolm X and hearing him, and so it was a lot of things that politicized him. I mean, because, he started off, being like a gang member, not like a gang member. And so, that was the sort of rites of passage for black men during that time. And when you're in a city like Philadelphia, with a mayor, and a police commissioner like Frank Rizzo, you see a lot of racism, police brutality, and I think all of those things were, balled up inside of him and helped politicize him outside, as well as the stuff that helped politicize him inside, which is more of what my brother talked about.
How did writing and researching about Martin Sostre impact you and your understanding of his politics and his positionality?
That's a good one. Well, one thing I'll say too that just occurred to me in thinking about the comment that Sharon made about Maroon's evolution and changing. Martin and Maroon both were, it's hard to talk about them as a single thing at any one time, right? Yeah, and I was just thinking too about like both of them were politicized by Malcolm, which is, another person who was just constantly evolving at a rate that you can't just talk about them as a single static way of thinking. So, so that's one of the things that drew me to Martin and that I took from Martin is not being ideological about struggle, but being very principled about it, right? So he had principles, guiding principles that were leading him to actions. He was very action oriented. And when he would undergo those actions, he would constantly be reflecting and changing his thinking based on how the state responded, how other people responded to it, which would lead him to new sort of contradictions and terrains of struggle. So he was just very dynamic in the way that he struggled and then the way that he thought about it, which left him really never in one particular place for very long. So that's something I took from him. And then I think researching and writing this book too led me to really have an appreciation for the importance of tangible, prefigurative counterstructures to creating something in the world that people can materially engage with that represents the world that we are building. That it is not just about conveying the ideas or the promise of a world that doesn't look like this, but building it in our everyday actions with each other, the way that we take care of each other, the way that we build places and spaces within this world, and that's how we recruit people into the movement, is so that they can actually see the way that those things change their life, right? Not just to say, we're gonna burn down the prisons, and people ask, well, what's gonna replace them? But so people can actually understand the world that we're building that has no place for prisons, no place for police, right? But people actually have to see and feel what that looks like. So I think those are the things that stood out to me.
So you guys grew up with a father that was, I'm sure, influenced you. Maybe you could both speak a little bit about how that worked and, how you are who you are because of that relationship.
So for me, I think initially it was just about a father-daughter relationship, needing to have that second parent in the home, or either that daddy's daughter type of thing. I think it wasn't until I actually moved to New York in 1990 that really helped me really digest who he was in the context of the politics that he had, because before I just didn't get it, I don't think, because I was young and I was just wanting my daddy. But I think moving to New York, walking those hallowed grounds with, some 20th century revolutionary Panthers, the women in particular, Safia Bukhari, I have a picture of Yuri here as well. And to meet these people firsthand, and you're like 21 or 23, I look back and I say, I missed a lot. You know, I learned a lot, but I also missed a lot being with them. But what I learned from them that was important was that my father's struggle was important. And it was important because they were also in that same struggle for liberation. And for me, I think it had a big impact because when you grow up in a capitalistic society, you know, you go to college, you go to find a job, and you know, you do all of that, but you then don't think about the injustice that comes with capitalism, right? The haves and the have-nots, so to speak. And so for me, I think it just opened up my eyes to be more aware of, you know, I think as Garrett said, you know, the way your actions speak louder than just talk. And my father was all about action. You know, he spoke a lot, but you see him acting out as well from 2 to 3 escapes. Like, he was not just talking. He was like, I'm going to fight for my freedom at all costs, you know, whether it's through incarceration or not. So for me, I think it galvanized me to be a better person for humanity, because that's really what it's about, us as people, right? And how we live together and coexist as one. And for me, I think that was very important to learn early, but I still didn't totally get it. But I think meeting, you know, like I said, Sofia Bukhari, Janet Ciro, Yuri, you know, all the, you know, Panthers and BLA members that were still alive. It's like, oh, I know your father. And I'm like, I don't even know him. You know, so for me, I leaned into those stories, which helped me learn who my father was.
Thank you. Where I want to go with this question is that my father was really tough on us as children in the context of making sure that we kind of knew what was going on, politicizing us in a multitude of crazy ways, his own creative, kind of strategic. He's always being strategic about every little thing. You know, so he had this thing where he was like, each one of us, and I would watch him do with other people, do the same thing he did with me. Be like, oh yeah, I want to talk to you about possibly taking on an African name. And I was like, bro, like, okay, but I'm cool with Russell. You Russell, I'm Russell. You know, like, nah, we go around and around, back and forth. And this was the thing too, is like my dad actually taught me how to think critically. That's a big thing to me. I wasn't a critical thinker. He like and asked questions and really kind of run you through the thing. And so I didn't want to change my name, change my name. Didn't want to change my hair, change my hair. He was like, you haven't thought about dreads? I was like, bro, like what is this? Where are we going? You know, why? And then we would ideologically go around and around and then with dreads. And then I watch it happen with my sister. Then I watch it happen with my other sister, and I'm just sitting and watching her. And I'm like, dude, you got a whole little game you got going here, a little system you got going here, whatever. We all went through it, and we all, you know, I think we all were better for it. And so we had this strategic way of kind of moving, and, you know, and while he like, shh, you know, like, I'm talking to Boobie now about her hair. You know, and I'm like, bro, okay. You know, and so I love that. You know, that part has come into me, and I take on young people in that same way. I was telling folks at a speaking engagement last night that I have some young people in my life, some young organizers, and they actually give me orders, and I take them. And I'm telling people, take orders from not just any young person, obviously, the one who you see that is, you know, rising and doing the work and needs support. You want to support them people, because that's how my dad was doing throughout. My dad had 1 million people he was supporting in that political education way. So yes, that's what.
So, I mean, this is complicated, right? Because all these relationships, certainly for the two of you, are in the context of prison, which, you know, I mean, I know this somewhat, having had kids visit me when I was locked up, and it's just, you know, the impediments to healthy relationships are like huge, huge. So we all land in this place. So maybe my question is, given in your case, Garrett, having done this research and written this piece about a pretty amazing person, and for the two of you, given your relationship to your father, you know, how does that work for you in terms of where you see yourself in relationship to a pretty crazy world right now? I mean, I'll use the word crazy just because it's neutral, but we know it's pretty horrendous. People ask me, how are you doing? I'm great in a horrible world, you know. But, so there's a lot of these values that are unresolved that we still have to fight for. So how are you impacted by your relationship and understanding to these people who have dedicated their lives to trying to advance liberatory struggle?
Gosh, I could take this in so many different directions. I think the one that sticks with me because of Martin is he had, and I'm guessing that Maroon had this same revolutionary optimism of, like, Martin believed at every second that there were revolutionary conditions happening and that it was imminent and that he was a part of it and all the people that he was struggling with were a part of it. Like, there was just no point where I could see defeat in his writings or his actions. And part of that is also his understanding of fascism as ever present, right? Not this kind of like incipient, you know, we're about to hit fascism or fascism is on the, you know, but I think he had this framework of minimum and maximum security, that he was in maximum when he was in prison. When he got out in 1976, he returned to minimum security. And I think that framework for me was really helpful in just thinking about the conditions of living under the state and the way that the prison is a concentration of those, but is not a world unto itself, you know, as opposed to us out in the so-called free world. And I think about it a lot in terms of the censorship that he was experiencing in prison and how the prison essentially acts as a laboratory for fascism, right? So all the things that they do in prisons, they try out there to bring out here to all of us. So when people would freak out, you know, 2, 4, 6 years ago about book bans and the rising censorship, it's like, I can't get a book into prison on the daily, right? And so people talk about that being emblematic of fascism, and they're right. But the fascism is here. It's just, where are you in the fascism? Are you behind the wall in the fascism, or are you outside of the wall? So I think for me, thinking about this political moment through what I've learned from Martin, it's just helpful to think about the gradient and the location of where we all are in relationship to a fascist society, an authoritarian one. And, you know, where our own struggle lies in that, I guess.
I just want to agree with that. I think, you know, it's on that spectrum of where you're at, and I think it does start in the prison, you know, the book bans, the writing. I mean, you know, we've been doing it for over 30 years, so we've witnessed, you know, the various repression that takes place in the prison, and then we see some of that bleeding out into our communities. So, you know, I just want to say I agree totally with that.
Me and Garrett were on a podcast, and one of the things that really struck me about that work and intersects this question is just the impact that incarceration and that institution has across a multitude of different spaces. As he pointed out, it's just a macro and a mini version of society, and so they say they're in prison, they're in maximum, and you're just in, general pop. Y'all just general population. You think you're free, but you're actually not. And that's one of the biggest, kind of illusions that we are under. And my dad made that clear, and Martin is making that clear. And one of the ways that, it's really interesting to me how he's picking and choosing his battles. Now, my dad he would pick and choose, and his battles was like always over the fence, and so, but his strategy reminded me very much of Robert Woodfox from Angola 3 and his struggle internally in Louisiana, which is very known for sexual assault and rape culture in prison. And this is something that we're not talking about, and we don't talk about. And most of our PPs are totally against it, and will fight and die for other people in that way. And so for him to choose that as a mountain to die on, or an issue to say, hey, you guys, we shouldn't be bending over and coughing for people and having them, that's a sexual assault. For him to name it that way, to frame it, and all of that, and then say, not just to the people in prison, which is a whole nother conversation, like Albert was explaining, it's not easy, man, to talk to dudes and say, hey, we're gonna stop this, or we're gonna actually take physical action against those guys. And so to pick certain things in prison and decide that this is the struggle, this is what we're going to, and then politically educate other people in the prison, which is not an easy thing to want to fight for this, because they're going to lose things. They're going to be in the hole. They're going to go to the hole for not taking down their pants and whatever. This level of work, and then to transfer that to your outside campaign of people who follow you and say, if you get locked up, don't let them do that to you. And for them to be like, oh, yeah. And then to get locked up and be like, yeah, we're not doing that. And Martin said, we got politicized that, and we're not doing that. It's huge, dude. It's a huge level of organizing that is intimidating on some levels, would be intimidating to other people, because you have to have those uncomfortable conversations with other men that we should be having that we're not having. But it takes a lot to use that as an organizing tool. You got all these other things. People getting beaten in prison. You could just go with the easier, low-hanging ones that'll be more downhill. These are uphill issues. When you're talking about rape in prison, you're going to stop it. Oh, you're going to stop it? How you going to? There's some big dude who's generally into bully culture because he's trying to physically, take something from someone. That's a huge thing to me. And it speaks volumes to the people who we're talking about.
I mean, one thing occurs to me, because you brought up the level of resistance and the kind of incessant assault to people's bodies, is everybody in prison isn't male or male identified, but in fact, there are women and there are people who are non-binary who experience this too. Did that come up in any of your conversations or any of your work with respect to Martin? Did he address it? I know Maroon did, and so you can speak to that, but I'm not sure if Martin Sostre ever really addressed that.
No, I mean, we're talking about him resisting the sexual assaults in 1973 or so, and so that wasn't part of the discourse that he was using, but I do think it was worth noting that at that time, with as prevalent as the sort of defense of black manhood language was, that he framed it as personhood. He said, this is about defending my personhood. So he didn't frame it in this specifically male-identified way that I thought was important and noteworthy.
In 1970?
Yeah, at a time that he was reading women's liberation, yeah.
For Maroon, I think it was a 22 years in solitary. But when he came out, and when he got the greater for it, he calls me. And he says, you know, they locked me up, and, you know, he was talking about the binary, it was someone binary, I'm not sure what the designation was. And he came up to him and just said, man, I know who you are. Are you this person? And my dad, you know, is always refrained, but he's always like, everyone knows him when he gets to the prison because of his reputation. And so he had a conversation, binary, I believe it was, and he took a step back and said, you know, this is something that I had never encountered before, but this is someone who made sense to me, just like he did with the juvenile lifers. For him, it was another piece of education that he could use in some way to be, I guess, a sense of less of an oppressive state for those people who are different from him. He knew this person was different from him, but he also realized that this person also had issues that needed to be addressed, that hadn't been addressed, and that prison wasn't ever going to address. So that was something that he had discussed with me.
Did you want to add?
Yeah.
Yes, quickly, and then maybe we can see what.
I don't know if this ties into the story. I think it's someone different. But Daddy at some point was like, oh, they put me in a cell with this dude. And he's young and he's wild, kind of, sort of. And so I was like, yeah, you know, it's cool. You know, he's like, nah, it's not cool. This dude tried to, we talking cool, everything cool. He know who I am and all of that. But then I think, for lack of better terms in my mind, what my dad was saying, like he tried to test me. Like the dude tried to test me to see, you know. And so I was like, oh, don't worry about it. He's like, no, you don't understand. And I was like, oh, snap. You know, he's really serious and he's concerned because he's older now. And one of the conversations that we had was about, geez, why am I forgetting his name? But a PP here who was assassinated by the state when he was older. We met his daughter. Why did I forget his name? Why can't I forget his name? But at any rate, my father, Hugo Purnell, thank you, Hugo Purnell. Right, and so what Hugo, my dad was like, I don't want the Hugo situation to happen to me in the context, like they got this young boy with me, and so I was like, well, what you gonna do? He was like, I'm gonna grab inside his pants and I'm going to squeeze. And I was like, Dad, he's like, listen, I'm in a situation, that's why I called to talk to you. Like, I may have to do some things that I, you know, haven't been in a situation I have to do in a long time, but this is where I'm at right now. I can't defend myself in the same way that I used to be able to defend myself. And so this is where I'm at. And then the situation resolved itself. Some other people came in and spoke with the young brother, and then he was transferred out before any confrontation.
Okay. People must have questions. And really check these books out because, you know, Maroon's book, totally worth reading, and Garrett's book about Martin Sostre. They're in the lobby and afterwards. Please check this stuff out. You'll learn a lot. But are there questions? We'd like to make sure it's a question and not just expository.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I could listen to you all day. I am very curious for reflections on sort of the contemporary situation with political prisoners. And I'm also really curious the intersecting discussion that you just sort of started to raise around gender. You know, when we think about women who are political prisoners, we think about, you know, local luminary Angela Davis, we think about Assata Shakur, we think about Kathy Boudin. But a lot of the women political prisoners that I'm aware of currently are around the Plowshares movement, radical nuns, the environmental movement. So I just threw like maybe 4 or 5 questions at you, but I'm very curious about sort of the contemporary situation.
Okay. So, in reference to those questions, the Shoatz family has a program with communities nationally, and these communities nationally are doing work around political prisoners through an apparatus called CurbFest. And CurbFest will happen this Sunday in Oakland, co-sponsored by the Bay Area Book Fest. And CurbFest is a celebration and a fight for the liberation of all political prisoners. And you know, it shows up in multiple different ways in multiple different communities and looks different ways depending on what the resources and so forth are in that community. But it could be anything from tabling and people passing out our information that has, you know, different political prisoners on palm cards with their bios, to full-on festivals and everything in between.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing, maybe I would say in response to your question about gender and political imprisonment, from my earlier comment, you can probably tell I'm really not for creating a hierarchy of struggle. Like, I think we all just need to be struggling in multiple spaces, the ones that are closest to you. The one that is close to me is the struggle to free the Mississippi 5. And that's 5 women. We've actually added one. So there's 6 women now in Mississippi. And these are women who were sentenced in the late 80s, early 90s to life with the possibility of parole. And, you know, if we want to get into the kind of like understanding all imprisonment as political, at the moment when they were sentenced to that, or to plea deals to that, the idea was after 10 years you go up for parole, maybe you get hit once, you come home after 12 years. And they've all been in 35 to 40 years now, and my friend Loretta has been denied 14 times. So she comes up in December for the 15th time. And her son is my age, and she went in when he was 8 months old. So the sentences that Claude mentioned earlier that they were handing out to people like Martin Sostre, they've been handing out for the last 30, 40 years to everyone, right? These life without parole, life with the possibility of parole that actually winds up being a death sentence. So, you know, that's the one that's closest to my heart, is struggling to bring those women home who are just facing a parole board that is entirely appointed by a single governor, a governor who has said, I will not grant clemency, I won't even use the power of clemency. So the only way that they have to come home is the parole board. And they go up for the parole board, and this is a national issue, this is not a Mississippi thing. Everywhere across the country, parole boards deny people on the same discretionary grounds, crime of conviction, which you've already been sentenced for, right? There's nothing you can do about that. Crime of conviction, insufficient time served. Well, what is sufficient time? You know? So people go up before these boards, which are acting as judge and jury and executioner all at once, and have total discretion. So that's how I'd answer that question.
Anybody else? No question?
Someone else?
Please.
There's a hand here.
And there's one there, and there's one there. I want to get all of them. I want to hear all the questions.
Thank you. I just want to thank you for all the work and for sharing so deeply about these struggles and these people. My question is, sort of one clarification that I wanted to ask is, I think you said for Maroon, you know, the neighborhood he grew up in, the culture at that time shaped him. And I'm curious, though, did that shape other people around him? Because I feel like many people might go through that experience, but may not always end up like Maroon. And then sort of a part 2 to that is just, what was the impetus for deciding to write a book for each of you, and having to relive some of the experiences, especially for both of you, in, I'm guessing, a shorter period of time, and how did you like heal or deal with some of the difficult things that were coming up as well as part of writing this on a personal level?
So I will address the first part of your question. With my dad, he had a mystique about him, he had a way about him that no one was ever going to be like. But he has comrades, the Philly 5. and really it was 6. You know, so it's multiple people who all engaged in those same experiences. No, they all didn't escape from prison or what have you, but they all are, Uncle Saeed, crazy, you know, but all super revolutionaries, you know, all to the end. One of the things about the Philly 5 case that people don't know in that context is that they all got life and they never told who the shooter was. And that was the whole thing for them. There's like, make it Russell or make it Saeed, make whatever y'all choose, and then we can let somebody go and 4 people won't have to be locked up and blah, blah, blah. But yes, so that was, no. So yes, people did, but Maroon is unique in his way, but there are other people, and they still need support too.
And I'll just say quickly that he grew up in a middle-class neighborhood with 2 parents, loving, but I think that spark for him inside, and if you read I Am Maroon, he lays it out, you know, the middle-class neighborhood and everything with regards, but he had a little disdain for the police brutality that he saw at an early age. And he looked at his father and said, look, you just closed the door and didn't say anything. So he had a disdain for that as well. And so that fueled him to be, you know, that activist with them. But before he got there, he was living that street life of what it meant. And I think early on for black men at that time, the rites of passage was to be in a gang, you know. And we know it from Malcolm and we know it from various other places. So I think, you know, from us not having our ancestral legacy that, you know, gangs became that rites of passage for him. But I'm not going to say because we have a little bit of time. I don't know. Do we have more time? And so did we answer all your questions? Was it another question about us and how we grew up, or?
Yeah, just the why you chose to write a book about his life.
Yeah.
And
Well, yeah, that was, you know, and like I said, when I went to New York in 1990, a guy came up to me, your father was all that. I'm like, really? You know, because I didn't know who he was, really. I mean, I knew he was my father, don't get me wrong, I know he birthed me, but I really didn't know him because he was behind bars since 72, you know, I was born in 65, so, you know, I really didn't get to live with him. So I think when those people started approaching me, I leaned in to hear those stories about my father. So I wrote them. And I was like, who are you? Because I don't even know you. These people say, you know how to steal a car, you know how to do this, you know how to do that. I'm like, well, who are you? You know, because he was saying, oh, he sold cars and we drove in the best cars. And I'm like, oh,
Your father still
the best cars, right. You know. So anyway, we began the dialogue, and that's how the book came about. And then he ended up working with Kanya in the end to bring about the book. But for us, it was a family document, really. It wasn't supposed to be a book. It was really supposed to be a family archive for us to know who he was.
Thank you. I am curious about, as like the people who are the keepers and sharers of these stories, just from like the publishing side of things, the challenges and successes that you've had in just like elevating your work. And then additionally, if there's time, like considering your guys' perspectives, just different strategies for us as everyday people to challenge the systems that we're in, right? To continue to elevate these stories and what we can do to start to organize.
Okay, I'm up. Well, I appreciate that question because it gives me a chance to shout out AK Press. So thank you to AK for publishing this book and just being incredible supporters and comrades in struggle. One of the things that I'm particularly grateful that they did was agree to publish a paperback version for incarcerated readers at the same time as the hardcover to get to that question of censorship. If you don't know, hardcovers can't get inside. And so we published a kind of watered down. The other thing you should know about censorship is they don't read past the cover. So it's called The Life of Martin Sostre, so the revolutionary life. And you'd be surprised how that makes a difference. Yeah, oh my gosh. So yeah, I'm extremely grateful to be able to publish with AK and for all of us to have an anarchist collective like them. And in terms of struggle, oh man, you know, I just think to Martin's politics, that everything is a terrain of struggle, right? Like our bodies are a terrain of struggle, our communities are a terrain of struggle, the places we work are a terrain of struggle. You do not need to create single issue struggles. They are all intersecting, they are all on a plane together. So you don't have to go somewhere to find a way to struggle, right? You can just look around in the world that you are in already, and choose something that pisses you off.
I think in a period like this, as resistance increases, we also see what the political aspect and the use of imprisonment looks like in a much clearer way. So this question of political prisoner, in a period like this, when people are locked up because of their positionality around Palestine, or deported because of where they're from to suit the interests of the people in power, we are also going to be experiencing an increase of people from our communities who, because of their political commitments, are going to experience imprisonment. So I think what that says to me is that our antennae have to be up, and our responsibility to not allow people to be disappeared, taken away from community and family is increased. And so the lessons of Martin Sostre and Maroon Shoatz are part of that continuum, because they, coming up in the period of the 60s and 70s, clearly staked out a position in relationship to the repression that goes back to the genesis of settler colonialism in this continent. And we're going to be seeing more of this. And so what that means is we can use these lessons that are encapsulated in the 2 books that are in the lobby, among others, to try to understand what the underpinnings are. This didn't just start. We're not just experiencing this for the first time. And the value of that, I think, is what, to me, makes a panel like this so important. And to that, I'm thankful to be able to be part of it, along with Garrett and Sharon and Russell. I think, what do we have, 2 minutes? 3 minutes left. If somebody else wants to chime in, that'd be great.
Thank you, and thank you for having this panel here. I'm really interested in this idea that you all brought up, as that we're all subject to this prison system. We're all in general population, I think is what you said. So I'm interested in what you all view as the biggest or most egregious or most threatening manifestations of that, that system for all of us.
Can I just say the state and pass?
Okay. Okay. Oh, come on. You and Garrett have become Shoatzes against me. No, I think that's a wonderful question, and the analogy of us being in that space is work for us. Simply to me, yes, the state is our and biggest kind of fight constantly, and I would say also internally. Making sure that we have solidarity, making sure that we understand the class over all of these other little things that come up. Like Martin Sostre was saying, that we can find the struggles and bring them together. They're not separated. We find ways to separate them, but they're
just say, I can't be Maroon. I would love to be him, but I think we need to all find our space and our niche, whatever that is, that works for you. But we all see oppression, we all see injustice, and whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in your communities, we all need to collectively, as my brother said, come together and talk about how we can resolve some of those issues. Because, as Claude has said, we're moving more and more towards that. And we can see more people being incarcerated, right? And we are the global leader of incarceration. So we don't want to continue that, right? So collectively, as a country, you know, we need to come together and look at what that really means, right? And then take a strong stance and do what you can do. I'm not saying what you can do because only you know what you can do. But you need to take a stand and do something.
And that's our stopping point. Join us in the lobby.